what does it look like through the pelvis, through the lumbar, and through the rib cage as you get into hip extension, as you get into shoulder flexion. And that gives me a really good kind of look into their level of awareness around how to coordinate those specific ranges of motion, which are more demanding ranges of motion. And then from there, I'll start to pick it apart a little bit. And kind of as I'm talking to this, as we're kind of bringing attention to this right now, I'm going to make a statement, and you could let me know if you agree with this, because I haven't really put specific thought into this. But the way that I'll start to train this is that as I introduce the idea of ribcage movement, ribcage stability, there's always going to be some sort of focus component on that specifically. But then as we get into training, I kind of focus on resisting movement through the rib cage in lower body exercises, and then promoting movement through the rib cage in upper body exercises.
I'm going to come through with it. In my brain, it's a big that depends.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. We'll expand on it. But kind of the way that this, like, the way that I came to this is that, okay, if I understand that someone's having a hard time manipulating rib cage position, or understanding how to create stable positions through the rib cage as it relates to the pelvis and the lower body, as it relates to the pelvis and the upper body, or the scapula, typically what I'll do is I'll work on something that is challenging to them with their current capability, in terms of like a warm up, whether that's something like lower stimulus, like low stimulus would be like literally rolling the lats and the pecs, but like something like a bit greater stimulus, like something where they're dynamically creating movement, or in a slightly resisted way. Like one that I really like for the T-spine is like a half kneeling banded book opener, right? So it's like one knee's on the ground, one hip is flexed, they have one arm in front, and then they're just opening up. They're using the posterior musculature to create posterior rib cage rotation on one side of their body, and they're resisting it on the other side. I like both components of resisting and creating movement there. That's like something pretty low tier I'll go through, or like a side plank, I think, is a really good entry into understanding how to resist movement through the rib cage. Is that, okay, we're going to get into a stacked position, not necessarily aligned with gravity, right? Like if we're talking anterior posterior tilt, like we're on our side, like gravity's not necessarily impeding our ability to get into a neutral degree of pelvic tilt. But what we're doing is we're resisting lateral flexion through the rib cage. And I think that's like subconsciously, whether people realize it or not, that's a level of coordination that they need to be able to possess before we can start to create dynamic rib cage lateral flexion. So I'll start with like, literally just that as a circuit. And like another one that I'll use is like lying flat on your back, like a supine 90-90, like hips at 90 degrees, knees at 90 degrees, heels on a bench. I was having them do kind of a curl up in that position. And like the idea here is that we are getting into a position to now understand pelvic tilt, and we have sensations that are associated with that then I can have them come back to and reference later in the workout. Like if I'm going to do an RDL, like I need you to understand how to create a neutral rib cage to pelvis orientation. So like remember that thing, that supine 90-90, or that thing we did on the ground in the beginning. I want you to feel those sensations as we do a hinging movement. And it might be some regressed hinging movement for someone like that doesn't have an understanding of this awareness. But like for me, the most impactful way to teach people things is to get them to feel it, and then force them to recreate those feelings in different scenarios and start to associate them to different movement patterns. So it kind of starts in that way, is that like when I have someone that doesn't have a good understanding of how to coordinate their rib cage, their kind of torso to pelvic mechanics, it starts with getting them to feel specific sensations, and then getting them to come back to those in a more challenging way in short proximity, like from warm up to A1 or B1. And then from there, like I was kind of saying earlier, is like, I think obviously we're going to be stronger in resisting movement through the rib cage than creating movement. So I think a really good way to start to scale that resistance is through things like, say, a contralateral load on a single leg RDL, B stance RDL, a split squat, a lunge, walking lunge, something of that sort, I think gives us a really good stimulus. And it's more of a subconscious stimulus because we're now getting them into a position, we're cueing them into a position like, all right, now just hold that position, feel those sensations throughout the duration of this set. Once we lose those sensations, then we're done with the set. And I think that starts to build up a base level of awareness of the muscles that control that range of motion. And then as we start to move to the upper body, I think scapular mechanics and the way that we move through the shoulder, that associates really well with rib cage rotation, lateral flexion. So things like where we're going through some sort of rotational press or pull movement, or like a unilateral like an overhead or incline press, there's going to be some degree of lateral flexion with that. So I start to integrate more dynamic rib cage movement with scapular movement versus, or even like on a in a lower sense, we could start with static rib cage on the upper body with like a rear delt fly or like some sort of row where they're finding a position that allows them to go through like protraction, retraction at the scapula, and then we can start to associate that to some sort of press or like end of spectrum like a kettlebell windmill, where they now have to dynamically uh, change the position of the rib cage to accommodate the stability that we need at the scapula to be able to maintain that range of motion. So I think that's maybe a little bit deeper layer of why I tend to associate static rib cage with lower body movements and dynamic rib cage with upper body movements.
I think I'm with you on that. No, I like the idea of creating like bringing the unconscious awareness conscious. Like, you could watch two clients perform a Bulgarian with a contralateral load, but one client is being cued in the intent of, hey, I want you to be mindful of the upper body while you're doing this. Feel this like counter rotation movement. Like, in that case, you're going to be using, your lat on the loaded shoulder side and the glute on the opposite shoulder side to like resist that rotation of having that shoulder fall towards the opposite knee. And that's your counter movement through the rib cage. And then when you go to, cue that book opener, or you cue the book opener before, it's like it's a feedback loop, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a feed forward loop, if you will. So where you take the other person and you just go, here's Bulgarian, do Bulgarian. Now they could both do Bulgarian the same way, but how many are going to get that opportunity to have the awareness around the rib cage while they're performing the lower body movement, which then feeds forward into their awareness in the upper body through the rib cage when they're doing upper body movements, right? Like, you take those two people side by side and you send them off, and then in 2, 3, 4 weeks, you were to reassess, and not even necessarily, and I think this is worth talking about, not necessarily assess range of motion from like, we're going to bust out the protractors and goniometers and measure it, but who has more loadable range of motion with exercise selection. And that was something that I think is kind of paramount, is this idea like around assessment and a hyperfixation around assessment. Like, you and I, I was probably sitting next to you when we were learning about, and I air quote learning about, like measuring joint angles with little fucking, and I'm like, what are we doing here? Right? Like, I'm not going to bill insurance. I'm not going to do fucking car crash rehab bullshit. And like, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
So the idea, like, I don't care. I don't care to he has 47 degrees of extra. It doesn't matter, right? Like, what does that mean from an exercise standpoint, right? And I think that's where that model, I like that idea of like, all right, we have an opportunity, even in our lower body sessions, to start to create awareness around our upper body mechanics. And when we get back to our upper body mechanics, we haven't been, days separated, depending on your training split, but potentially days separated from cueing this. Every day you're getting a small dose. And if we look at training like learning, that's going to prompt the motor learning process, is that high frequency. So I like that idea of drawing attention to the rib cage. I also like that the assessment is minimal. And I think for me, one of the things from an assessment standpoint is, there's like a couple of progressions protocols that I kind of follow, that I adhere to. but it's different from region to region. So like I tend to follow, and this is, you'll see this in most rehab settings, sagittal frontal to transverse.
Yep.
If you're dealing with someone who's just off the table, almost regardless of whatever the surgery is, you're likely going to approach reinstating movement in that way, right? It's sagittal plane joint orientations tend to be better supported with both like inert soft tissues, right? Your discs, your meniscus, these are all things that primarily promote compression, sort of this sagittal plane loading. And then as you get into frontal and transverse, your structural stability tends to fall away and you tend to rely more on muscles. So integrating, coordinating, stabilizing, all of this becomes more important. And that's a little bit more complicated neurologically, a task to overcome, because you don't have the same structural support when you move through the transverse plane or the frontal plane, right? Transverse being rotation. However, one of the things I find in people that work with this model, and one of the things that I've found in myself working with this model of like sagittal frontal transverse, is kind of peeling back and going, okay, why do I think this way? Why do I think this way? Why do I approach movement this way? And it's that very idea of like, well, when I'm working in the sagittal plane, I tend to have at the very least more structural stability at the joints I'm working with, right? Like if I think of my elbow joint, right, or where my olecranon meets my humerus, where my olecranon fossa meets my humerus, where my ulna meets my humerus. It's like that joint is articulated in a way that allows for sagittal plane motion, right? But if I think of the structural stability of that true, it's more or less a hinge joint. And then I think of the structural stability and just the cross-sectional area of my radial head in my ulna. And I think of this tiny little disc slipping in this with this small little, UCL ligament holding it together, ulnar collateral ligament. And I'm like, well, there's just way more surface area, right? If I think of my ankle joint, if I think of the talus and the tibia, as that moves through the sagittal plane, and like obviously it's not exclusive sagittal plane, but as my shin goes over my foot, that's a lot of surface area of the bottom of my tib and the proximal aspect of my talus. But then I start to think of like, well, what do I move through inversion and eversion, or pronation and supination of my foot? I have like all of these small little tiny joints that now have to come into play, which don't offer me as much structural stability. So if I look at the principle behind sagittal, frontal, and transverse as a progression, and I'm like, well, it really comes down to like the structural stability. That's why I do it, because we're more stable and we have less inhibition around sagittal plane motions, because the joints are just articulating in a way that have more structural stability, that have more surface area. If that's the underpinning principle, this idea of surface area, these joints and structural stability, I almost can do away with that in the sagittal plane, or sorry, not in the sagittal plane, in the thoracic spine, because it's like, okay, I could look at the T-spine, and this is something that I've kind of evolved and adapted over time, and I can approach it the same way. I'd be like, all right, we're going to look at T-spine through the sagittal plane. We're going to look at T-spine through the frontal plane, and we're going to look at T-spine through the transverse plane. But over time, when you realize it's like, well, the reason we approach it in that order at a shoulder or at a knee or at a foot or a wrist or an ankle or an elbow is because the prevalence of structural stability kind of affords us a little bit of a margin for error in the sagittal, less in the frontal, and even less so with the transverse. But when we deal with the T-spine, the structural stability of the ribs is a unique feature to that region that actually changes the way we interact with sagittal, frontal, and transverse. So I am, say for a knee, I'm pretty diligent. Like if I'm dealing with strain sprain, or if I'm dealing with a surgery almost of any kind, I'm going to be following that to a T. Passive range of motion through the sagittal plane. And then as you get that from passive to active assisted, then we maybe introduce frontal plane, and then abduction, adduction of the hip, passive. And so you kind of just have this succession that's always being led by the tip of the spear being, the sagittal plane progression from passive, active assisted, active to active resisted. Mm-hmm. But the T-spine, it kind of just became a waste of time, because it's like the ribs are going to give you this transverse plane structural stability that you don't have anywhere else in the body, right? And this is something from a principles perspective that I think is really important, because as people go through, and I don't want to like, pick on any system, but when you start to learn systems instead of principles, you just go like, okay, this is what we do at the shoulder. This is what we, like, I've seen people take bands and distract the shoulder in the same way you would distract an ankle. And I'm like, well, hold on a second, man. Like, don't just go like subluxing your shoulder for no reason before you train in some unmitigated traction with a band, and then just do the same thing at the ankle. And it's like, it's your joint by joint protocol. It's like, well, no, a joint by joint protocol has to respect the arthrokinematics of each joint, and each protocol has to be different. So you can't just go through some sequence of like, I do the same sequence for the shoulder as I do for the knee, as I do for the ankle. Cause like that structure function relationship is so different. Yeah. So when I look at the T-spine, it is the most unique structure function relationship in the entire body, in my opinion. Like, you could get into the mechanics of the upper cervical spine, which is obviously pretty unique, like C2, C1, base of the occiput. And to a certain degree, all joint mechanics are unique, but not many are unique and important, right? Like, I'm sure like there's mechanics of the navicular or like the calcaneal inclination angle. Like, sure, it doesn't mean dick, but like when it comes to like, no, you have 12 massive fucking, dinosaur bones that wrap around your thorax in a way that's like completely different than anything else we see in the body. Like, this is the only like sagittal or horizontally oriented structure in the body. Everything else sort of falls in line straight down. And here we have these bones that are wrapping around horizontally. So my point being is that I'm much more eager to go at all three planes at once. Right? I don't look at it necessarily as the same progression and regression that I look at with the sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane with literally anything else. Now, one of the reasons that is because of this horizontal structure, right? Because of the uniqueness of it, we tend to run into less like what I'm going to call clinical issues in the T-spine. I know a handful of people who with like thoracic spine disc issues, but it's probably 1 to 100 the number of people I know with cervical spine, and 1 to 1,000 with the number of people I know with lumbar spine, right? And it's because of this. So the proof is in the pudding that the robustness that is afforded to us by the uniqueness of the structure function relationship of the rib cage means that like we have a lot more deference to push this a lot farther, a lot quicker. Right. And this is why we can get away with the things in the T-spine, principles of loading in the T-spine, that we can't get away with principles of loading in the cervical and lumbar, right? Like loading in extreme flexion. It's like, yeah, you can absolutely load the T-spine in extreme flexion. Cervical spine, you're going to be fucking, you do that, you're going to end up like Christopher Reeves or Stephen Hawking. You're going to be talking into your fucking shoulder, playing a little violin. But it's like with the T-spine, you're able to load that because of the rib cage. So I think understanding the principle allows you to get really bullish.